It's all around us. Nature, organisms, ecosystems, life. All connected by biodiversity. We see and interact with biodiversity every day. But do you and I really understand it? How does the web of life connect? And how are we, the human species, threatening biodiversity?
My name's Lauren.
And my name's Ella, and we're biology students at StFX.
We're here to talk to some experts about biodiversity, what it means, what it looks like, some of the threats facing biodiversity today, and what we can all do to change that.
We'll get a glimpse at what people are researching in biology. Come on.
I study how insects survive winter and the factors that make it difficult for them to survive. My research relates to biodiversity in the sense that I study how environmental factors affect whether organisms can survive or not. So that gives us an idea of what environmental factors like temperature or snow can limit diversity in the areas around us.
My main sort of research area is the biology of seaweeds, but over the years I've also done a lot of work with terrestrial plants.
Well, my research centers around invertebrates, so animals without backbones, creepy, crawly, slimy critters, and we do a variety of different things with them. It tends to be a mixture of study of their behavior. We also study their brains, so how the brains control the behaviors. A lot of our research is not really directly focused on biodiversity, but what we do is we exploit biodiversity. So we tend to do a lot of the behavioral studies are on one specific species, but many of the questions we want to try and answer in our research can only be answered with specific species out there, and so we're basically drawing on biodiversity to find a particular species that's going to help us answer a particular question.
Before 2012, I was looking at the development of a flowering plant, including genes that were regulating the shapes of cells, and then the shapes of the cells affecting the form of the entire plant. But since 2012, I've been helping my colleague David Garbery, providing the cell biology part of his work into one of the most common plants on the shores of Nova Scotia, which is Ascophyllum nodosum.
I have two major projects on the go. One is the diversity of insect life in ponds that are frozen over. The biodiversity that we're exploring under the ice in ponds is much greater than anyone expected. It's even said in the literature that the insects go dormant under the ice. But what we found is it's not true. It's a beautiful array of creatures still active there.
So I'm looking at a particular type of cell that transports salt, that allows fish to live in seawater and keep their blood salt content basically the same as ours. I'm looking at the diversity of a single protein, and that single protein is the one that causes cystic fibrosis in people. It's called cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator. It's a real mouthful.
I am looking into dried beans and their associated flours and protein isolates. So we're seeing which protein extraction method works best on the beans and produces a high quality food product. And then we're taking that protein isolate and trying to make it taste good.
My name is Harrison Moore. I'm a regional biologist with Lands and Forestry for the province of Nova Scotia. So my background is in herpetology, which is the study of amphibians and reptiles, and the other portion of my research is in ecotoxicology, so the effects of pesticides on wildlife. My work is related to biodiversity in a few different ways. I deal a lot with forestry and different developments, so when we get proposals for that type of work, I review them and provide recommendations on how they can proceed taking biodiversity into account.
My research program looks at a a symbiosis between unicellular green algae and some amphibian embryos. The one we focus on in particular here is called the yellow-spotted salamander. In the big picture, my research would be contributing to understanding how symbioses themselves contribute to biodiversity.
Biodiversity is really the study of the diversity of living organisms that exist in a particular place at a particular time.
Probably the simplest way to think about it is the amount of, or the variety of organisms in a part of the world. So you can talk about global biodiversity, and so that's the total number of different kinds of organisms across the globe.
To me, biodiversity is having lots of toys. Children can play with a bear, but their life is a lot more enriched when they have a variety of toys, different types and sizes and shapes to play with. It helps develop different parts of their brain, their physical and their mental abilities. So if I had 20 bears, I wouldn't value this little bear so much. The same with the other toys here. And the world around us is a bit like that. So all the different environments on the planet, they all have their different toys or different organisms that are best for that environment. And we benefit from that.
This is something that has occupied biologists and natural historians for centuries. And with modern techniques, we're actually really beginning to really come to grips with, what is the true diversity of life on this planet. And we can use those same techniques to actually see what is present in our local environments.
You could talk about the biodiversity in Antigonish Harbor, which is going out there and figuring out what are all the varieties of bacteria, of algae and plants, of animals, fungi. There are fungi in there also. Add all of that up, that's the biodiversity.
So that's kind of the technical aspect. To me, biodiversity refers to the wonder of all living things.
The wonder of all living things is right. The simple question, how many species are there on Earth, isn't so simple of an answer. Scientists discover new species every day, and most have yet to be uncovered. If you do want a number, it's in the millions. But why so many? Why is all of this biodiversity important?
Biodiversity is essential for the organisms on the planet to respond to changes.
If you have a diverse group, it is a more resilient group, right? So a more diverse environment is going to be able to better cope with challenges, be they environmental or otherwise.
I'm not aware of any species that can just live by themselves anywhere. Every species depends to some extent, whether indirectly or directly, on some other species.
It makes for a massive network, a complex ecology that is really important.
In the same way that a diversified stock portfolio is important. If you invest in one company, that's a very high risk reward profile. So if the company does very well, you do very well. If the company doesn't, you either lose a lot of money or you could possibly go bankrupt yourself. In the same way, biodiversity has the tendency of buffering itself to change. So from networks of species interactions, some of whom play redundant roles maybe in their ecosystem, if there's some major ecological perturbation, like humans, for example, there can be resistance to change. They can buffer themselves against change. So in the ultimate sense, life depends on biodiversity, but also in the sense that matters most to us, how much can we push the Earth systems and still have them essentially function, purifying water, producing protein for us, and all those kinds of things.
It's important because it's one of the key sort of metrics we have for looking at the health of our environment. Has this environment substantially changed? Can we see differences now versus 10 years ago versus 20 years ago versus 30 years ago?
From a human point of view, Biodiversity is important because, you know, from a selfish point of view, we don't want to just see pigeons flying around. We like to see other things, okay? There's also the medical aspect and other aspects. Who knows where our next drug is coming from? So it could be medicine, it could be some material for engineering purposes. There's just so much we don't know, and we don't want to ruin it before we find out.
It's important to diversify our food system to help prevent any overproduction of certain products or crops, as this can lead to over-harvesting and monocrop productions, which in turn can cause harm to our soil. It can cause increased land use and deforestation, which in turn can relate to climate change.
In the case of natural ecosystems, not really, because whatever level of biodiversity has evolved naturally is appropriate. So it can be high, it can be low, it doesn't really matter. It's just whatever evolved.
The more biodiversity, the more redundancy, the more fail-safe the planet itself is. In the same way that we don't build cars or really any human device, if we can avoid it, with where all the components depend on one critical part, because if that critical part is broken or goes down, the whole device ceases to function.
When you start introducing things that are not native to a system, you can really cause more harm than good.
When you get invasive species taking what that would be an example that I would classify as too much biodiversity.
So imagine an island population in the middle of the Pacific. There are plenty of endemic species, so species that evolved there and have evolved in a scenario in which there are very few competitors. And all of a sudden, an alien species arrives from some other shores. It rafts over on some seaweed or something. And because the species that live there don't have a history of having to outcompete very many other species, that newly arrived species could take over and outcompete a lot of endemic species.
Bees are a common example of when bees came from Europe to here, knocked out all of our local or native pollinators, and now we're running into trouble because our bees are dying. So it can definitely, while the effects may not be imminent, they can definitely have a long-term negative effect on our system.
There are certain cases where people might prefer lower diversity. For example, if they're putting things in the ocean and having organisms grow on it, they probably want less of that and less diversity. And so that, you know, some of our research is actually actively targeting that. But in terms of where humans truly are gathering the benefits from ecosystems that haven't been massively disrupted, certainly the general rule of thumb is more biodiversity is going to be better.
Well, habitat loss is the number one. Introduced species is number two. Overhunting used to be a problem in some areas like North America. Regulations are now in place. There's still poaching, but it's not this massive free-for-all anymore here in North America. We lost the passenger pigeon, a bird whose flocks clouded the sun. Okay, it actually got noticeably darker when a flock of passenger pigeons flew by. Migration. Yeah, so and I understand that there's still problems in the rest of the world, especially with poaching with highly charismatic species like rhinos and tigers. But yeah, habitat loss is the big one.
So species can disappear for simply natural reasons of evolution. There are changes in the habitat or the organisms around them that mean that they're less able to survive. And that's an entirely natural thing. It's been happening from the onset of life on this planet. Species can also disappear because of catastrophes. Right now, there's a lot of evidence that we're going through another one of those catastrophic events. But unlike the past ones, which were triggered by these massive geological things or a meteor striking the Earth, the mass extinction that's going on right now, where lots and lots of species are heading towards extinction or are already extinct, that's caused by humans.
What makes a species disappear? Mainly humans, it seems to me today. But of course, if you look at the broader picture, what makes a species disappear is some change in its environment, whether that's a human derived change or whether it's a spontaneous natural change, because life's all about change. The planet is continually changing, and it would do so even if we weren't here.
Being outcompeted for one reason or another is another way to go extinct. You just can't make it anymore because other species have figured out better ways to extract resources and grow and reproduce, and you just simply get outcompeted and you die.
Whether it be through land use, pollution, litter, carbon emissions, and so on, human activities are impacting the planet. How exactly are humans affecting biodiversity?
Well, greed. You know, do we have to have more and more and more? Do we have to have, you know, the huge lawns? Do we have to have huge estates? Do we need to eat so much meat? I'm not a vegetarian, but, okay, could I reduce my meat consumption?
On average, and particularly because of anthropogenic forces, these days, the number of species on the planet that are evolving new is much less than the ones that are disappearing because of us.
The effects we are creating on the environment through pollution, creation of cities and farms and all those other human made modifications of the environment that remove habitat. And then finally, of course, the release of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels, which is driving global warming and all the knock-on effects that has, all the effects that increased carbon dioxide has on the changing temperatures around the planet, changes in weather patterns in the oceans. It's increasing the acidity so that it makes it harder for organisms to form shells, etc., etc.
So the big one I think right now is just, habitat fragmentation and loss is the big one. We've encroached on huge amounts of area, and in doing that, we've contributed pretty greatly to climate change.
An example that I'll give is in Central America and parts of South America, banana republics, which were countries or areas that were specialized in a singular crop or resource, so bananas being the most common. And these countries put everything into singularly growing bananas. So they dedicated all of their land to that, and so what happened is that they basically had this rich, fertile, diverse landmass that they monocropped, and now it's, not as useful and the market's crashed. So you're just left with a piece of land that, you've run off all the flora and fauna, and now you're left with something that one isn't environmentally sustainable, but it's now no longer economically viable.
Habitat loss, over-harvesting, global shipping, which moves a lot of marine invertebrates around the world. So all of our major harbors around the world are massively polluted with species that didn't used to live there but got shipped in essentially either on the ballast water of ocean-going vessels or attached to their hulls. And then the last one, of course, is climate change. Organisms do have some ability to acclimate, they have some ability to evolve, but it's limited. And it takes time. And so if you change the environment very quickly, such as we are doing, then some species will not do well. Other species will do well, but you'll witness an overall decrease in biodiversity.
Whether we're talking about one of these environmental catastrophes or a human-induced catastrophe where we start having lots of species disappear, the primary driver behind it is disruption of the ecosystem. So you have these chains of food chains in the ecosystem. So one organism relies on another for its survival. And what happens when you have these massive disruptions is those chains get broken down. And so the effect that we create, perhaps through global warming, might only directly affect 2 or 3 species, right? They can't survive because of the warmer temperatures. But then that effect spreads because there are species that eat those species, and of course they no longer have any food, so then they die off, and then the species that eat those species, they die off. It's not the direct effects, it's the spread of effects through the ecosystem that really causes species to disappear.
Learning about environmental problems can be frightening, but one of the most ineffective things we can do is let ourselves simply lose hope and give up. How can everyday people like you and I protect biodiversity?
There are lots of little things that people can do in their day-to-day lives to try and make environments around us more habitable for organisms. But I think the biggest thing we can do is vote for elected officials that care about the environment, care about conserving the environment, and think that climate change is the biggest issue on their agenda, because they have the power to make bigger changes than single individuals do.
Keep your cats inside. Cats are one of those introduced species. There are more, okay? So keep your cats inside. It's safer for the cats, it's better for the environment.
There are lots of different things that people can do. Many of them are, of course, linked to how you spend your money. So if you are conscious about what you are buying and what the influence of whatever, the production of whatever you're buying, what the influence of that is on biodiversity, then of course an everyday person can have lots of effects on biodiversity. So for example, if you take the time to figure out which fish are harvested in a sustainable manner, then you can help protect biodiversity by choosing the right kind of fish at the grocery store.
It's just important to know where your food comes from. It's important to try to purchase locally grown in-season produce, which can be kind of a struggle in Canada in the winter, but you know, getting your tubers and your roots. And also just research the companies that you're buying food from. See who promotes fair trade and sustainability. Try to steer away from any sort of mega monocrop companies, and just, yeah, really support the little guy.
I think of it as a ranked list of priorities. The most important thing on the planet right now is CO2 in the atmosphere. If it was me that I was just taking stock of my life, I would choose that one as the one to focus on. And there are many aspects of one's life that contribute to carbon emissions, including the food you eat and the transportation systems you use, and go down the line. And so that's a good place to start.
What the everyday person can do to preserve biodiversity, it's totally up to you and what your interests are. So a lot of people I know, they want to help bees. There's a lot of different species of bees in the wild, besides domesticated bees. And so their goal, so they achieve that goal by planting flowering plants that will attract and sustain bees, provide lots of nectar to them.
Become an advocate. Simple. Right now we're having a fight in Nova Scotia about forestry. The problem with clear-cutting forests and planting forests that are single species is that you are ripping out the biodiversity and destroying habitat by doing the clear cut, and then introducing a single species back, which is by definition not biodiverse. So simply by writing to your local paper, your MP, your MLA, talking to the people in lands and forestry about what they're not doing with the Landry report, there's lots of things that an individual can do to say, We want to have the biodiversity of Nova Scotia preserved.
So there you have it. You heard our experts. Let this be your call to action. Walk away from this video and implement just one of their suggestions in your own life, whether it be shopping locally, keeping your cats inside, planting more flowers in your yard, or become an advocate and spread the word about the importance of biodiversity.